Okay, greetings friends in the room and our audience online as well on YouTube. I'm Ed Steinfeld. I'm the director of the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs. And if you don't mind, while I'm speaking, I'm going to take my mask off. It is truly my pleasure to welcome Danielle Holley-Walker to Brown and to the Watson Institute. Dean Holley-Walker will be speaking on the topic of examining anti-critical race theory legislation. This is obviously an extraordinarily important topic. It's an important topic in the United States, but I also want to emphasize it's an important topic globally because the phenomena that Dean Holley-Walker is going to be talking about involve a variety of different countries, a variety of different contexts, a variety of different institutional settings. And while I recognize there are a variety of events going on in the world that are demanding our attention, this topic is one that absolutely needs to be front burner for us. Let me just note that, of course, after Dean Holley-Walker is done speaking, there'll be opportunities for people in the room to ask questions, but also our audience online can ask questions. So I encourage you to do so through the comment section on YouTube, and we'll be sure to get those questions to Dean Holley-Walker. And with that, let me invite Brown's president, Chris Paxson, to come to the podium to introduce our guest. President Paxson.
Thank you very much, Ed, and thank you, everybody. Thank you for coming, and welcome. Good afternoon. I'm really thrilled to be here today to introduce Danielle Holley-Walker. We've had the great good fortune of having her here at Brown this year as an ACE Fellow, American Council on Education Fellow, which is a very prestigious award, but it gives us the benefit of her insights as she's been doing a lot of special projects at Brown and just, participating in the community. It's been fantastic. So she is currently Professor of Law and the Dean of Howard University School of Law in Washington. She received her BA from Yale, her JD from Harvard, and after law school, she clerked for Chief Judge Carl E. Stewart of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit, practiced civil litigation in Texas for some period of time, I don't know how long, and then prior to coming to Howard, she was Distinguished Professor of Law at the University of South Carolina. She's a scholar of education law and civil rights, an expert on diversity in the legal profession and higher education, and she's published articles on issues of civil rights in education, including No Child Left Behind, charter school policy, desegregation plans, and affirmative action in higher education. And today she's going to speak to us about examining anti-critical race theory legislation and the backlash that's developed against anti-racist movements, as well as the history of statutes that attempt to block certain viewpoints. As Ed said, this is a very timely, very important topic, hot button issue, and one that I know I find fascinating and also concerning. So I look forward to hearing more. And so with that, please welcome Danielle Holley-Walker. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me today, and to everyone here and everyone who's online. So the topic of my talk today is on anti-critical race theory legislation. I want to say a few words about how I come to the topic and my interest in the topic. During the first decade that I taught in law school, I taught a class in Race and the Law, which had a huge component of it was based on race, racism, and American law, the textbook that is thought of as kind of the seminal textbook of critical race theory. So I did this for almost a decade in various settings, including at the University of South Carolina, where I was the first Black woman who was a tenured track faculty member there. And the first time I ever taught critical race theory, it was taught to an all-white classroom. So I was the only person of African descent in the classroom. It was not thought of to be particularly controversial. Most of my students in the class were of conservative political background, and that's how far we've moved. From 2005 till today, when that same class under current South Carolina law would likely not be allowed to be taught. And we'll talk a little bit about that in just a few minutes. So my talk today is going to span a lot of different subjects and hopefully pretty quickly. Let's see if we can get it moving. It's frozen a little bit. There we go. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about the history and creation of critical race theory, what the term critical race theory means, both in the academic sense that I've traditionally taught and thought about it, and then what it means in terms of the definitions that are being used under the legislation. I'll talk about a few key tenets of CRT, and then the rise of anti-critical race theory legislation, and talk about some of the bills that have been passed, but also some that are kind of moving ahead now. And then at the end, I'll talk about the really early legal challenges to that legislation. I think there will be quite a number of legal challenges. We're just very early on in this cycle of the creation of this legislation. Let's see. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about the history of critical race theory. And before I do, I want to preview a few of the takeaway points from my entire presentation so you can see kind of where we're going. So I hope to demonstrate a few key points. The first one is that the statutes that we'll be talking about today really have nothing to do, or very little to do, with what we think of as the legal scholarship or legal theory that is known as critical race theory. So that's the first thing. Instead, they have been recoined in an umbrella term that's really being used for political purposes. The second, I'll look at the Trump executive order from September 2020 that has really become what we would think of as model legislation for many of the anti-critical race theory statutes that we see passing. Even though those statutes are becoming, the proposed statutes are becoming broader and broader, the original kind of inspiration for many of these statutes is the Trump executive order of September 2020. Third, I'll seek to demonstrate that this is not traditional legislation in the way that we think of it. We typically think of legislation as having many purposes: to regulate, to authorize, to outlaw, to provide funds, to sanction, to grant, to declare. It is not clear yet if the statutes that are being passed will actually be used for any of those things that legislation is typically used for, but instead may simply be used as political talking points. So not clear yet how much we will actually see real enforcement of these statutes. But finally, my final point will be that despite lack of enforcement, the chilling effect of these statutes is very real, and we are seeing the outcomes of those chilling effects in many of our public colleges and universities. So who you're seeing on the screen is Derek Bell. And Derek Bell is really the father of critical race theory. Critical race theory, as we think about it, evolved in the late 1970s, in the 80s, and then through the 90s. Derek Bell was a longtime professor at Harvard, and he wrote a seminal law review article in 1980 that critiqued Brown versus Board of Education and argued that Brown versus Board of Education was not actually a representative case for kind of altruistic thoughts about public school education or a need for real integration in our public schools, but really was part of what he would call interest convergence, the notion that rights for minority communities, and specifically rights for African Americans, will never be vindicated under the Constitution unless there is some clear advantage to the white population of the United States. And in the context of Brown, Derek Bell argued that really it was the Cold War that brought on Brown versus Board of Education, and the need to be able to say throughout the world that the United States did not promote a racialized or apartheid-like democracy, but instead had a fully racially integrated democracy. And so that is the core of Derek Bell's thinking about the United States legal system, is that literally everything is underpinned by race, that many of our landmark civil rights cases are of limited practical impact. So he would say the resegregation we see in our public schools, for example, is not surprising because Brown was never really intended to integrate the schools. And finally, that racism is so deeply rooted in the makeup of American society that it reemerges after every wave. So he would say what you should always look for in the pattern of racism in American law is progress in the law on race and then quick backlash to that progress, and often the backlash takes us back to places that maybe we hadn't even experienced before the racial progress that we saw. So Kimberly Crenshaw is the professor, Columbia, UCLA, who coined the term critical race theory. Critical race theory really emerged while Derek Bell was away from Harvard. So Derek Bell went to University of Oregon as the dean of their law school. While he was away, the law students wanted to keep going a lot of the work that Derek Bell was doing. So they put on a series of guest speakers at Harvard that was based around Bell's Race, Racism, and American Law course. And they also dug very deeply into the concept of critical legal studies, which posits that the law is really complicit in exacerbating inequality. And the critical legal studies movement really looked at class primarily. And so what Crenshaw and the students did was really to take that focus farther away from class and more towards integrating concepts of race. So what they did is they went to University of Wisconsin in 1989. This is kind of the seminal critical race theory retreat, where they had a professor, David Trubeck, who is at the center of the critical legal studies movement. And they held these workshops at a lot of different places. Wisconsin was the first. They held one at Howard Law also. But in the midst of this, what it was called was the retreat, the Conference on Critical Race Theory. And so basically Kimberly Crenshaw took the kind of idea of critical legal studies and then inserted the word race. So that's where the term really comes from, is an extension of critical legal studies. So I won't spend too much time on this, but just wanted to, in case anyone in the room is interested in the difference, that the idea of critical legal studies is that we take a very critical eye to the law as it is, with the notion that destabilizing the law can increase the ability for the law to create social justice and more equity in society. Critical race theory similarly holds that the law has the potential as a tool for emancipation and racial equality, but only if we take a critical eye to the law as it is and ask the question of how has the law propped up racial inequality and racist structures in our society. And only by asking those questions can we begin to move the law to a place where it can actually be a tool for emancipation and racial equality. If you've read a lot, I would encourage you, if you haven't read the Critical Race Theory Reader, all of these people are the scholars of critical race theory: Cheryl Harris and Patricia Williams, Richard Delgado, Mary Matsuda, etc. And I would say there's a whole new generation of critical race theory scholars, including Angela Onawachi-Willig, who's the dean at BU's law school. They are putting out a new book that's on the modern critical race theory. So when we think about how in legal scholarship critical race theory is defined, we think of, Bell says it really means to tell the truth, but Crenshaw more particularly says that it talks about race as a social construction and how law can perpetuate a caste system that relegates people of color to the bottom tier. And Tara Yasso has famously said that CRT is an approach to theorize, examine, and challenge the ways in which race and racism implicitly impacts social structures, practices, and discourse. All right, so a few key tenets of critical race theory, so you'll know how to spot it when you see it and know when you're not seeing it. The first is that race is a social construction. So the idea that there is no real significance to race on a biological level, but that all of the imbuing of meaning that we give to race changes on the basis of the context that you're in, and that there's a huge amount of social construction that happens that teaches us when we are raised in certain circumstances, so here in the United States, teaches us what it means to have skin color of certain tones and imbues meaning into those kind of facial differences, but that it's not a real biological reality. Racism is embedded, as I talked about, in the systems and institutions. So this is important because often we talk about racism as an individual bias or individual prejudice, or the idea that someone is racist. Critical race theory teaches us to think not about the individual, but the structures that prop up and propagate racism, but to focus less on the individual and more on structures and institutions. The idea that it's not isolated, right? So we talk about this a lot when we talk about reform of the criminal legal system. The idea is there one bad apple in a police department? Is there a bad apple in a corporation? Someone in the corporation or the institution who's perpetuating racism. Critical race theory teaches us not to think about racism as bad apples, but instead to think about it as systems and institutions in which we have to change those structures and change the laws that codify and allow those structures to exist, but not to focus as much on the individual or the idea that racism is propagated by individuals, but more that it's propagated by structure. And the idea that experiences matter. So this is why you have things like narrative in critical race theory. So if you read an article like Space Traders, which is one of my favorite critical race theory articles by Derek Bell, he's a narrator in the story. He's kind of the person who takes you along on this journey where aliens come down to Earth and ask if they can take away everyone who has darker melanin than a certain amount. And then the US government has to negotiate with the aliens to figure out, will they give away this portion of the population for untold riches and getting rid of climate change and getting rid of inequality and lots of other ways, but all you have to do is give us this group of people. Derek Bell is in the story as he tells it. So many of the critical race theory scholars put themselves inside of their own scholarship and tell their personal individual narratives. So narrative is a very important part of the theory. All right, so now I want to give you a timeline of how did we get to where we are today, to a place where critical race theory, which again is a legal theory that is taught in law schools, and it is an elective. No one is forced to take critical race theory in law schools. Some colleges and universities have critical race theory courses. It is almost unheard of to have a critical race theory course in K through 12. So much of what we've heard, critical race theory is in our schools. It is very difficult to find an example of a public school with a critical race theory course. Pretty much doesn't exist. There are some in some private schools, but I want to talk a little bit about how we came to the moment where critical race theory is now considered to be something that needs to be targeted in broader legislation. So probably the beginning of this was the publication of the 1619 Project. So on August 14th, 2019, the New York Times published, which was a little pamphlet almost, that has now become known as the 1619 Project, which has a lot of, now has a book associated with it, schools associated with it, merch associated with it, et cetera. So there was quick backlash to the 1619 Project, and really not to the entire project as much as the beginning essay that's written by Nicole Hannah-Jones that talks about 1619 as the year of when Africans were first brought to the United States against their will to do work as the enslaved here in the United States. That really kicked off a pretty significant backlash. Tom Cotton, Senator, introduced a bill almost right away that was called the Patriotism Act, which said that no one who got federal funds should teach the 1619 Project. And there was a lot of discussion about the 1619 Project on Fox News and in other places, but you'll see the 1619 Project becomes a focus of a lot of what we'll see in just a moment. So then, of course, the day that we always remember, May 25th, 2020, when George Floyd was killed in Minneapolis, gave rise to then what becomes the longest period of social unrest or social movement in the history of the United States. The longest continuous protest movement in the history of the United States takes place in the summer of 2020. And I think what goes along with that is teaching about anti-racism, statements of corporations that talk about structural racism and the need to eradicate structural racism, the adaptation of diversity training in a lot of places where it didn't exist before, and just a huge spotlight and focus on books like How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi, or White Fragility, all of those books and readings that were really talked about in the summer of 2020. So if you remember, of course, we were also in the middle of an election cycle at that point, and part of what happens is then we see President Trump watching on Fox News someone talking about critical race theory, and that person's Christopher Rufo, and we'll talk about him in just a second. But essentially, the administration through OMB releases a memo that condemns critical race theory and directs federal agencies to desist from using taxpayer dollars to fund un-American propaganda training sessions. Then President Trump gives a speech at the National Archives naming critical race theory and the 1619 Project as toxic propaganda and ideological poison that will destroy the country. All right, so now I want to show you the executive order. That came out of this and really has become what is the model legislation for many of the anti-critical race theory bills that we've seen passed. So I want to go particularly to the definitional section of the language that talks about divisive concepts. So one thing that we'll see in common from almost all of the legislation that we'll talk about in just a second is the idea that curriculum and teachers, both K through 12, but also in public colleges and universities, should not teach this list of divisive concepts. And you'll see that many of them are phrased in very neutral ways. So the idea that you shouldn't teach concepts that one race or sex is inherently superior to another race or sex. Okay, that doesn't seem so bad on its face, seems fine. The United States is fundamentally racist or sexist, so that now begins to leach into some of those kind of core principles of the legal theory of CRT. That an individual by virtue of his or her race or sex is inherently racist, sexist, or oppressive, whether consciously or unconsciously. So now we're going to a lot of training about unconscious bias and this idea that people possess unconscious bias, but I would say that that also goes to any teaching that would be about white privilege, for example. That an individual should be discriminated against or receive adverse treatment solely or partly because of his or her race or sex. Okay, seems pretty benign. Members of one race or sex cannot and should not attempt to treat others without respect to race or sex. So a real plug for color blindness. An individual's moral character is necessarily determined by his race or sex. An individual by virtue of his race or sex bears responsibility for actions committed in the past by other members of the same race or sex. Any individual, and this is probably what I think is the most troubling one, is number 8, that any individual should feel discomfort, guilt, anguish, or any other form of psychological distress on account of his or her race or sex. So think about how broadly number 8 could be applied, right? So one of my favorite thoughts that I had when I first saw this was, remember the picture of Ruby Bridges, right? The little girl who's trying to go to kindergarten and she's surrounded by white National Guards troops and there is a mob basically yelling at her. Under this, arguably, if someone was disturbed, that an individual felt discomfort or guilt by seeing that picture of Ruby Bridges, this would be broad enough, this executive order, to say that I could not teach with federal grant money or any diversity training that's funded by the federal government, if I was presenting it to a federal agency, that I couldn't talk about that picture of Ruby Bridges because it might make someone in the audience feel discomfort, guilt, anguish, or any other form of psychological distress. Arguably, it could apply as broadly as to calculus. Calculus made me feel amount of psychological distress, right? So anything could possibly fall into that category if you really take it to as broad of a place as what they are envisioning in this order. All right. So one of the things I think that has happened is people have asked over and over again, why the term critical race theory, right? If it's not taught in K through 12, and it has minimal teaching in even universities and colleges, an elective in law school or an elective for undergrads, why would something like critical race theory become the centerpiece of this kind of restrictive legislation? And really, it is, and I agree with Patricia Williams, that it's a definitional theft, right? So the people who are propagating the idea of anti-critical race theory legislation really aren't attacking critical race theory itself. They're not talking about Derek Bell or Patricia Williams. They're not citing the work of Kimberly Crenshaw. This is really an umbrella political term that is being used to capture the idea of views on racial discourse, but from the right instead of the left. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in just a second. So the idea of reframing critical race theory into this umbrella concept came from Christopher Rufo, who's a conservative scholar. There's a really fascinating profile of him in The New Yorker, if you have a chance to read it. And what he said is he really believed that there was so much language on the left about racial progress. So whether you called it anti-racism, whether you call it diversity, equity, and inclusion, whether you call it educating people about the progress on race in this country, he said the left has really had a lot of language around the politics of race. On the right, we need our own language for how we characterize diversity trainings, diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. All of those things, we need an umbrella term for that, and it should include curriculum. So if you think of things like books, one of the books that's really come under fire is The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison. So if you think of any of those things, we need an umbrella term that will sweep together and really instill fear in people and make people afraid. And remember, this is all happening in the context of the election too. So this is all happening in the fall of 2020. So it's always great to be able to take someone's tweets when they make them public. So here you see him basically explaining what the strategy is. So he says, we've successfully frozen their brand, which is critical race theory, into the public conversation, and then we'll just drive up negative perceptions until it becomes toxic, right? So it really doesn't matter. It can be an empty term in some sense. So the words critical race theory, he thought that in particular would stir up fear in people, the words critical and the words race together, not having anything to do with the legal theory. And he admits that this has nothing to do with the original scholars, but the goal is just to have something that we can put in newspapers, et cetera, to have a decodified term that they can then recodify and annex to an entire range of cultural constructions that are unpopular among white Americans especially. So kind of taking a term that has lots of meaning, taking all of the meaning out of it, and then filling it with these umbrella terms. All right, so then in January 2021, so then what we see is first the executive order, and then in January 2021, we see state legislatures begin introducing bills that really have a lot of the exact same language as the executive order from September 2020. Okay, so now I'm about to show you some examples of some of the anti-critical race theory legislation. And one, again, is that critical race theory, the legal theory, that realm is not about K through 12 education. It just doesn't happen in K through 12. Anti-CRT legislation is not about critical race theory in the sense that it's meant to evoke more of this umbrella terms and really about diversity. A lot of it is teaching diversity. So one thing that Christopher Rufo did, and one of the things that you see in the executive order, if you have a chance to read it more thoroughly, is he gives examples of what he would say are really extreme diversity training. So one example that he gave was at Lockheed Martin, they took a group of white male executives and had them spend all day writing and reflecting about privilege. He gave another example of a school district in California where the kids were asked to line themselves up based on their skin color and whether they thought that they were afforded some type of privilege in society. So they were taught about white privilege and then asked to line themselves up. So the attempt is really to paint all of those things under the umbrella of critical race theory, but as we'll see in just a moment, the anti-critical race theory statutes are really about curriculum, and they're also about employment practices, and finally they go as far and are beginning to go as far as banning books, and we'll talk about some of those statutes in just a second. So there are a lot of statutes that have been passed. We do not have the kind of time. Honestly, I could teach this in an entire semester instead of just teaching it, just talking about it in this 1 hour. There are 13 bills that have been passed, and I only want to focus on 2 of them for the purpose of this talk. But if anyone is interested in all of the slides in which I outline every single one of these pieces of legislation, I'm happy to send it to you or make it available for you, but I want to concentrate on 2, which are Florida and Texas. All right, so Florida has taken a very kind of leadership role in a lot of the anti-critical race theory work that is being done in terms of the legislative space. In January 2022, they've just introduced another kind of omnibus bill in which is called Stop the Wrongs to Our Kids and Employees Act, which was announced by Governor DeSantis in December. So it's known as the Stop Woke Act. And DeSantis said in a statement that it's intended to, quote, eradicate what they define as corporate wokeness and critical race theory. And in June 2021, the Florida State Board of Education voted unanimously to ban teaching of the 1619 Project and critical race theory. So I want to take you to part of, if I can, SB 148, which specifically talks about banning certain types of teaching from K through 12. All right, so I'd already pulled up the language. Okay, so we're now in the part of the legislation in which they're really talking about curriculum. And you'll see that the legislature talks about acknowledging the fundamental truth that all individuals are equal and that no individual is inherently racist, sexist, or oppressive. No race is inherently superior. You notice that language is pretty much exactly the same, right, from the executive order. And so this is a perfect example of one of the points that I wanted to extract for this talk, which is that the September 2020 executive order then becomes the basis for legislatures in lots of states to pull that language out and then just simply kind of dump it into legislation that is now characterized as anti-CRT. And it does codify this notion of divisive concepts, right? And so here, when they talk about instructional personnel may facilitate discussions and use curricula to address in an age-appropriate manner the topics of sexism, slavery, racial oppression, including topics related to the enactment and enforcement of laws resulting in sexism, classroom instruction and curriculum may not be used to indoctrinate or persuade students to a particular point of view inconsistent with the principles of the subsection above, right? So if you really take the subsections above and then say you can still teach about sexism, slavery, racial oppression, racial segregation, but you can't do it in a way that you would ever imply that an individual, and in a way that an individual should not be made to feel discomfort, guilt, anguish, or any other form. Pretty inconsistent, right? So if you teach about topics like slavery or racial oppression, the likelihood is that someone is going to feel discomfort. So there's a lot of contradiction, I think, in those 2 parts of the statute. And also they're written very broadly, and when you think of statutes as things that you could actually have a remedy for, right? So if someone in a Florida school said, I was made to feel uncomfortable, how would you even begin to prove that up, right? So I felt discomfort, I felt guilt, I felt anguish. What would it take, and what would be the remedy for something like that, which we typically look for when we think about statutory language, is what would be the remedy? All right, so Texas is another leader in the anti-critical race theory statute movement. What's interesting is this is about the teaching of civics. So it's not just taking things away, but also creating a civics instruction program. But I wanted to show you specifically the kinds of topics that they are now excluding that used to be taught in social studies in Texas. So if you notice, they are now including a civics course, but they also have specifically in the bill taken away the teaching, the specific teaching of these particular things. Commitment to free speech and civil discourse through the writings of George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, writings from Frederick Douglass, the North Star, the Book of Negroes, the Fugitive Slave Acts of 1793 and 1850, the Indian Removal Act, Thomas Jefferson's letter to Danbury Baptist. So the legislature specifically striking these concepts from things that are approved to be taught in social studies classes in Texas. When you look at the list, it is very stark about what children in Texas will no longer be exposed to in their social studies curriculum. All right, so while we have 13 that have already passed, we have 24 laws that have now been proposed. And I think one of the markers of these statutes is they go much, much further than the original kind of September 2020 executive order. So if that executive order was really a model piece of legislation, and the other 13 statutes that have passed already try to do just as much as the executive order, which for the most part is limiting funding for certain kinds of teaching, also saying that curriculum should be designed in a certain way. These statutes go much further, and in particular, they begin to impact public colleges and universities. So beyond K through 12, we're now seeing this expand to speech in the public colleges and universities. Okay, so the one that I wanted to focus on, probably because it's the most broad, is the package of proposed bills. And I think Oklahoma is now up to 10 bills that have been proposed in this area. And in May 2021, Oklahoma Republican Governor Kevin Stitt signed into law a measure that limits teaching on institutional racism, the myth of meritocracy, white privilege, and the concepts of critical race theory. He signed the bill despite opposition from the Oklahoma Parent and Teachers Association, and later that month, legislators passed a resolution deterring the use of critical race theory and the 1619 Project in professional development for educators. And now you're going to see what they are proposing beyond what's already been passed. So first I'll turn your attention to SB 614, and this one bans public colleges and universities from endorsing, promoting, demeaning, or intentionally undermining any religion. But it also says professors may not endorse, favor, or promote socialism, communism, or Marxism. I saw a poster out here on one of the halls that was a group that was going to be talking about socialism. Apparently in Oklahoma, if this passes, professors would not be allowed to participate in that kind of discussion, but things that are pretty normal, I would think, for public colleges and universities. SB 1141 bars public colleges and universities from requiring students to enroll in any course that addresses any form of gender, sexual, or racial diversity, equality, or inclusion curriculum, and no course may be required as a part of a student's major that may include certain ideas related to race or sex. So that's becoming extremely broad. And the notion that you could even have certain majors, right, without teaching about gender, sexual, or racial diversity. The other thing that I think we see in the bills that are now being proposed is they've moved beyond race, right? So this is no longer just about race. This is also about teaching related to gender, and it's also related to teaching about gender identity and sexual orientation. And I think what we saw yesterday in Florida with the legislature passing the Don't Say Gay bill, all of this is part of the same thread, is part of the same movement, and we're seeing that in what are known as anti-critical race theory bills, but now we've moved so far away from critical race theory that it's really about just banning certain types of speech and curriculum in our colleges and universities also. Banning books is now clearly a part of this agenda. So SB 1142 prohibits public school libraries from holding or promoting books focusing on sex, gender, or sexuality in a manner that a reasonable parent would not approve, right? So the famous question we always ask in law school is, who is the reasonable parent? Who is the reasonable man? Who is the reasonable woman? In this case, the reasonable parent. In Texas, they've developed a list of 850 books that a reasonable parent may object to. It wipes out from the curriculum, if all of those books were taken away, almost all of the women authors, almost all of the LGBTQIA authors, and almost all of the Black and Latinx authors who were on the list of books that were taught or provided for in the public school libraries of the schools, that 850 person list. And so that's the kind of extensive list that we're talking about in this case. SB 588, again, goes back to K through 12 students, rights to an unbiased education that does not endorse, favor, or promote socialism, communism, or Marxism, and that is free from anti-American bias. And it establishes a student right to classroom space and school events free from flags and other paraphernalia associated with these ideas, and students and parents may file a complaint in the event that these rights are violated. So this is an example of how broad these statutes are becoming. Again, these are just proposed, and so we don't know which ones will pass, but you can imagine the effect if any of this passes. So I gave you a few more examples, but SB 1654, again, is a perfect example of how this has moved well beyond race. So it bars K through 12 schools from discussing or administering any survey or questionnaire related to gender or sexuality, and schools may not include in their libraries or make part of a curriculum any book whose primary subject is the study of lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender issues or recreational sexualization. So an extremely broad kind of movement ahead in terms of what these bills are proposing. Of course, we're back to the 1619 project, so this would, instead of just a legislative resolution, would bar public schools from including the 1619 project or related ideas about the history of slavery. Okay, so now I want to talk a little bit about legal challenges to anti-CRT. I think the thing that I'm asked most often is, how can they do this? This seems like a clear First Amendment violation. How could you prevent a public school teacher or a professor in a public college or university from being able to discuss all of the subjects that are talked about above? So I don't want to focus on all of this. I'll just talk about one case in particular that I'm sure Eileen is familiar with, the Garcetti versus Ceballos case from 2006, which is a U.S. Supreme Court case involving First Amendment free speech by a district attorney who wanted to essentially write a memo that said that even though they were filing charges against a defendant, he had himself done an independent investigation and found lots of irregularities in the search processes and other criminal procedure that had been used during the case. He was subject to discipline, basically didn't get a promotion because of it, and he claimed that his First Amendment rights were violated. In a 5-4 decision, the Supreme Court said that his First Amendment speech rights were not violated, and that when you are a public employee, that speech that you do on behalf of your employer and in the context of fulfillment of the responsibility of your job, that it doesn't have the same First Amendment protections. So there is a lot of leaning on Garcetti as the idea that teachers, professors, et cetera, are speaking as part of the responsibilities of their jobs and therefore do not have the same same First Amendment rights as someone is if they were speaking on behalf of themselves as a private individual. Okay, so we are about to find out whether these laws can survive legal challenge or not. And the first lawsuit to be filed to really take on an anti-critical race theory statute is American Civil Liberties Union of Oklahoma has filed suit against the state's controversial ban on critical race theory. The suit argues that the bill that I didn't actually pull up, HB 1775, prevents Black, female, and LGBTQ+ and Indigenous students from learning their own history. I think one of the things that's really interesting about these bills is that the public school population of many of the states that are most impacted are majority minority. So in Florida, only 37% of the students who attend public schools are white. In Texas, 70% of the students are minorities, 30% are white. So many of these laws are impacting students who actually have the identity that they are losing representation in terms of curriculum and the ability to talk about anti-racist concepts. So in this litigation, along with the ACLU, we see other plaintiffs like the NAACP, the Oklahoma University, AAUP group, American Indian Movement, Indian Territory, and the Black Emergency Response Team, which is a group of student teachers from Oklahoma University who work to make schools safer for diverse voices. And the central argument is essentially that that the statute is in violation of the First and the 14th Amendment, and that the Act's vague, overbroad, and viewpoint discriminatory provisions leave Oklahoma educators with an impossible and unconstitutional choice: avoid topics related to race or sex in class materials and discussions, or risk losing their teaching licenses for violating the law. So this is really the first major challenge to an anti-critical race theory piece of legislation, and we'll see how it progresses. There was another lawsuit filed about 2 weeks ago, February 17, 2022. 2 students have sued a suburban St. Louis school district over the decision to remove several books from school libraries. The ACLU of Missouri has sued the Wentzville school district on behalf of the students who aren't named in the lawsuit because they're minors. And the class action lawsuit alleges that books were removed because they contain viewpoints of authors or protagonists that are people of color or people who identify as LGBTQ. The district school board voted last month to remove The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison from the school libraries because they said its explicit descriptions of sex, violence, rape, and incest. And the board also voted to temporarily remove many other books while they are being reviewed. And so the ACLU says this just isn't any old book banning, as it happens from time to time where school districts disagree with the ideology of a book, but here Wentzville has targeted and removed books that are from the perspective and viewpoint of racial or sexual minorities. All right, so I don't know if there are many solutions to this at the moment, other than letting it play out. I will say a few things. I think recognizing that these laws are so vague that they could basically restrict speech from almost anyone. So while they are supposed to target one particular group, which is people who are promoting ideas of anti-racism, et cetera, they are phrased in ways in which they could be targeted to lots of other people, and anyone, regardless of political background and ideology, should be worried when the government begins to pass bills that are so vague in this way around our speech rights. I would say it's also important to reframe this discussion and think about it in the context of globalization. I won't say too much about memory loss, but to the idea of reframing what we are now calling anti-critical race theory statutes, as the NAACP Legal Defense Fund has called them anti-truth statutes, but thinking of other ways to really talk about the content of these statutes, including just talking about them as book banning or whatever the actual substance of the statute is, instead of adopting the language that was kind of originally put on these statutes that I've been using during this talk, which is anti-critical race theory, when we know it's not actually anti-critical race theory. It is anti-viewpoint, certain viewpoints, and also pro-banning books and dismembering curricula that has been thought for a long time to be a central part of what we do in K through 12 and also public universities. All right, so with that, I am happy to take your questions.
Danielle, could you just say a little bit about the case that you had after Garcetti that might...
Oh yes, let me go back. I know we have some lawyers in the room, so I didn't want to delve too. So, and Kia Xian, the Supreme Court held the country has an interest in protecting First Amendment rights of teachers in order for the educational system to be as free as open. So I wanted to give you both sides, right? So I wanted to give you, so the ACLU will be arguing from this case that more leeway should be allowed, for example, for a teacher who claimed that they were fired. So I'll give you an example. The Texas principal, there was a principal in Texas who posted a picture of himself and his wife. He's African American, his wife is white. He was reported by a group of parents for promoting kind of anti-racist teaching. He posted the picture as part of Loving Day, celebrating Loving versus Virginia, and he was fired from his job. And so he would attempt to argue that he was really under this particular precedent, that there should be protection for his speech because he's part of the education system. So I think distinguishing Garcetti, where Garcetti was a district attorney, right? And so you would say the free speech rights of someone who's a teacher or a professor may be considered to be broader than what Garcetti's rights were in the context of a district attorney's office. Yes.
So, thank you, Danielle. That was really terrific. Great talk. So the thing that I'm worried about is, given the political makeup of the courts, how a solution to this through the legal system would play itself out. And so when you showed the kind of diffusion of those laws, and I was thinking, so what's the mechanism that led to the diffusion, right? It can't just be mimicry, right? It can't just be like one conservative governor over the other, trying to fall over themselves to do it. So is there a way to politically disrupt that mechanism to try to bring about a solution, given that the courts seem kind of stuck these days? And then relatedly, your last slide about, it sounded like almost like rebranding. So in the same way that whatever the conservative guy took CRT and said, we're gonna make that a toxic brand and then fill it up with whatever we want, is there a way of rebranding these laws so that they are about book banning and things like that? I wonder what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I think in terms of what we're seeing in terms of the diffusion of this movement, it's spreading in lots of different ways. There does need to be an interruption, and I think the key to the interruption is probably at the local and state level. And so what we're seeing is, at first, there were local school board meetings in which the only parents who were coming were parents who were in support of these laws. And now what we've seen is that there are increasing numbers of parents who are against what the substance of these laws are that are showing up. So I think at the local school board level is an important level. Then many of the laws still need to be interpreted by state boards of education. So encouraging citizens to get involved at state board of education level to also say, okay, we need to better define what it means for something to be a kind of a concept that would consider to be a disturbing or disruptive concept. We need to better identify and regulate. And when they try to do that, maybe state boards of education will have a difficult time in spinning these broader pieces of legislation into actual regulation that would then apply more specifically to classrooms and public universities. What I will say on the negative side is none of that needs to happen for these to be to have chilling effect in being enforced. So what we're hearing anecdotally is that people who are applying for jobs at public universities and colleges are saying, I have two choices, University of Oklahoma, and then I have a private institution somewhere else. I'm not coming to the University of Oklahoma because I worry that my African American Studies department will be impacted by the inability to have classes on race as required. So this is having chilling effect even without having to do the work of trying to enforce it. So the last part, I think, how we can reframe a lot of this is I think that sometimes legislators get out over their skis, right? So I think when you start to talk about banning books, for example, that is a very easy concept to talk to parents about. So if you think about what happened in the Virginia governor's race, and this was thought of as anti-critical race theory, then when he came into office and he actually put out an executive order that said, here are the 5 or 6 things that I want to do that are anti-critical race theory, immediately the response was, you don't have the authority as governor to actually do any of those things. So I think asking the technical questions on the ground at the state level about what do governors and legislatures actually have the authority to do. I think we have to see a proliferation of legal challenges to make it very expensive for state legislatures and boards of education to engage in this kind of legislating. I think the more that there's increased litigation and focus on that, the less likely we may see that. But we're so early into this. This is only a year. I think things are going, unfortunately, I think things are going to get much worse before they get better. And that's what we're seeing. Is the Oklahoma bill was a good example. I didn't put up all the bills, but we have states where now there are as many as 20 varieties of these kind of anti-CRT, anti-teaching about gender, race, sexuality bills all over the country. And so I think things are likely to get much worse before, because even organizations like ACLU, Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, NAACP, now everyone who litigates in the civil rights space does not have the capacity to take on this level of legislating that's happening. So it will take a few test cases and hopefully they'll go well, and maybe that will also discourage the proliferation of these bills.
So these things may be completely unrelated, but a number of the states that are doing this kind of thing, they're also taking action to weaken tenure standards in public universities. Do you see those as
Absolutely,
being,
they're connected.
Maybe talk
So,
about that.
you know, so Texas is a great example. So what followed almost immediately from some of that proposed legislation is the idea that we should not be giving protection to professors inside of their universities because we need to be able to fire them under these statutes, right? So if you're going to fire them under these statutes, you can't have tenure protections for them. So now that's one of the bills that's moving through the Texas legislature, would take away tenure from any newly hired professor. So everyone who currently has tenure would keep it, but when you hired new professors, none of them would be eligible for tenure. And so there's a very close connection, because obviously tenure is meant to protect academic freedom, meant to protect people who would defy, you know, what they said. So, you know, talking to other professors at University of Florida, University of Tennessee, who say, I've already been asked to rephrase what my class is. So if my class is called Race, Racism, and American Law, we can't put that in the course catalog because legislators have people watching what's in the course catalog. So we'll need to retitle it, like my talk today would be retitled Recent Developments in Legislation. And then inside my classroom, I could teach about CRT as long as no one found out, right? But that is, you know, very scary, the idea of driving underground. But absolutely, and it's happening in Florida and many of the other states too, the anti-tenure portions are hand in hand with these bills that attempt to regulate what people teach, what's in the curriculum. It's all an attempt to control what happens inside of our K through 16 system on the public side. Yes.
Following up on Rick's question about the composition of the court, sometimes Clarence Thomas really surprises me on issues of race. Every once in a while he'll come out with something where he really strongly identifies as a black man. Do you think he's predictable in voting on this or on the affirmative action and education stuff, or do you think there's a question mark over the composition of a majority on these issues? You think this divides easily on conventional political lines?
That's a great question. I'm not sure if it will divide politically on these questions. Again, you have to pick, in terms of the right litigation that would eventually come to the Supreme Court, some of this is just so blatantly anti the principle of First Amendment speech that I would have to think that it would not divide along those political lines. I can imagine Chief Justice Roberts. I can definitely imagine Justice Gorsuch. I imagine many of them having an issue with some of these statutes. Again, picking the right statute is going to be key for this. I think that's why they picked Oklahoma. I think that's why the ACLU, of all of the places they could pick, the Oklahoma statute is one of the worst ones. So we'll see, but I'm not convinced that it will divide along political lines. I think some of this is, again, political propaganda that has now been installed in legislation that they don't intend to enforce necessarily, thus maybe not allowing for standing in a lot of these cases. But I think if there is a case that goes up to the Supreme Court with legislation that is as obviously anti-First Amendment as some of these provisions are, we could see, opinions that are 6-3, hopefully. Yes.
First of all, thank here. I'm a diversity and inclusion practitioner at a tech company based in Boston. And the industry has grown massively in the last year. So since the 2020, we've seen a 90% increase in diversity and inclusion jobs throughout the corporate sector. I'm curious from your lens, do you think that the fact that that industry is growing so massively can contribute to countering some of the narrative against this framework? And what responsibilities do you think businesses have to be a little bit more firm in getting involved in debates that typically are seen more political? For example, you're seeing a lot of backlash against Disney for not standing at all during the Don't Say Gay legislation.
So a couple of things. Yes, we see extreme proliferation in the diversity infrastructure. So diversity consultants, people who offer diversity trainings, etc. Some of that has grown even more since the summer of 2020 because the demand, especially in the private sector and on the corporate side, for increased diversity training has probably never been higher. But at the same time, I think in the public sector side, where a lot of diversity consultants did their work, that's becoming very challenging, right? So we went through a period, by the way, I think I said this, but the September 2020 executive order was rescinded by President Biden. But that period from September through January, there were a lot of diversity trainings that were canceled. You think of diversity consultants who rely on doing trainings for the state, which there are many. I think that is being hampered a great deal because of these pieces of legislation. But it doesn't stop the corporate sector, private sector from including more of this kind of anti-racist diversity trainings, et cetera. But it worries me that we're headed in such two different directions in our public and our private sectors. If corporations are incorporating even more of this, and in our public sector we're seeing less of this, I think that it again creates a huge divide. I think about universities and colleges in terms of private colleges being able to say, okay, come to us, because we don't have these kind of bans, whereas public colleges and universities may suffer greatly because of this. So that definitely worries me, but I am encouraged that in the corporate space, there's probably never been more demand for the kind of training that's banned from our public schools and colleges and universities as we've seen in these bills.
Hi, I want to thank you so much for speaking to us. I really enjoyed your presentation. We met briefly, but my name is Amiri, and I'm the founder of the Black newspaper on campus. So needless to say, I'm very interested in speech and being able to speak a truth. And I'm really curious about the legal parameters of how this isn't a violation of free speech. And I know that you spoke to it a little bit, and I don't know if it could be answered simply, but when you were speaking about how you'd have to change the name of your talk if these bills were to be passed and it was at another university, I'm wondering how, if you're limiting your speech, is that not a violation of free speech?
Right, so that will certainly be the argument, right? So they will take a professor who will be the plaintiffs in these cases. So if we ask who will file the lawsuits in these cases, it will certainly be a teacher or a professor who claims that they were no longer able to teach in their designated area. They were no longer able to promote a curriculum that they had. They were fired from a job because of the content of their speech. So that's certainly what we will see litigated. I think the questions around public employees and their ability to speak. So for example, if you think of a regular first grade or second grade teacher, so much of what is in their curriculum is prescribed by state standards, right? Nothing wrong with that. So there's no mistake that these pieces of legislation, what they're often doing is just amending curriculum statutes. So they're not trying to write on kind of new legislation, but instead they're just saying, we already told you what the parameters of social studies would be for sixth graders. Now we're just going to exclude the writings of Frederick Douglass teaching about the women's suffrage movement. So they're not attempting to go outside of that parameter, but really normalize the regulation of curriculum in this way. I think that we will see significant First Amendment challenges to this. I do not think it's necessarily political. I think you'll see judges probably of all stripes who have an issue with this under the First Amendment, and we'll find out very soon. I don't think we know the answer though yet. Yes.
So regardless of whether some of these bills pass, what do you think will be the long-term effects on public institutions for even having to deal with, the introduction of some of this legislation?
So one thing that I didn't focus on as much is employment, right? And so a lot of this says you should not be subject to any limitation in terms of your license, certification, et cetera, if you do not believe concepts like the divisive concepts that they define. But what that could mean is more and more people, we're seeing a tough time recruiting teachers already, so we can see impacts as far as recruiting teachers. We definitely could see, it's interesting when we talk about parents and students, we often imagine the parent and student as someone who is white instead of non-white. We could see more parents begin to move their students out of the public school system with restrictions like this. I think that there are just endless amounts of fallout from this. I think the book banning is extremely concerning. When we see books like in Oklahoma, you remove the book first, and then only if they agree that it is not divisive does it go back into the library. So imagining, a Texas list of 850, you could see the shelves of public libraries emptied from people saying, I object to this book or I find this book divisive, and then the review only comes after that. We know how long it takes administrative processes to work. That could be 2 years, 3 years before a book is put back on the shelf. So in everything from teacher recruitment to students and parents wanting to leave the public school system to emptying of shelves in the public school libraries, I think all of that is fallout from this. Sorry, no leeway. Yeah.
Thank you so much. This was a fabulous talk. I have this kind of adjacent question that I've been thinking about. Like a lot of the challenges that we're seeing, as you mentioned, are starting at the school board kind of level, and you're seeing this rise in a some kind of construct of parental rights. And so it's no longer legislatures, or there's like a literal movement to talk about how parents have some sort of rights to determine the kind of education that kids have. So it becomes not the faceless legislature. It's like, this is for my child. This is I'm dying to hear, based on where do parents get some rights from? Like it's not in the Constitution, nobody said they have rights, so where exactly is that legal kind of argument coming from?
I love that question because it's one of the things about this debate that's so interesting is that for years, the understanding of curriculum and curriculum formation was this is done by experts inside the State Board of Education. So how do we know what kids need to learn in 5th grade math? How do we know what should be the learning objectives and standards for a 10th grade AP government class? All of that was determined by experts inside the State Board of Education. It was not subject, even though there were notice and comment periods, so there were periods where parents would be able to give feedback, but the notion that curriculum is determined by feelings of parents is not something that we've seen traditionally in the adoption of curriculum, but it has become very much the language of the politics around this, right? So again, back to the Virginia debates around this, and the answer that the Democratic candidate gave that was wrong, that ran in the ads all the time, is he said, I don't think parents have a right to control curriculum. That was basically the end of his campaign, even though technically we know that curriculum is not determined by parents. It's the same as asking the parents of my students in civil procedure, what should I teach them in civil procedure this year? They don't know what I should teach them in civil procedure. So I think that is another way into talking about this and to reframing a lot of these conversations as about expertise and about the expertise of state boards of education and respecting state boards of education expertise around curriculum, including social studies curriculum, English curriculum. There was some reason why the State Board of Education believed it was okay for students to read The Bluest Eye, or it was good for them to read The Bluest Eye, and I think we do need to do some reframing around that expertise question. Yes, right here.
So your talk began rooted in legal and sociological scholarship, and I imagine that theory has not stayed static during these events. And so picking up that thread, where do you see that headed?
That's such an interesting question, is how critical race theory, the legal theory, what the irony of so much of this is that it exemplifies what critical race theorists have always argued, right? So what they would say, so what Derek Bell would say if he were here right now is, you would have to know that the anti-critical race theory legislation movement was coming if you looked at the protest movement of the summer of 2020. When people saw the multiracial, very young coalition of people who were on the streets in the summer of 2020, his theory would say that there would automatically be a backlash that was much stronger than what people in those demonstrations were promoting, which was essentially to convict the people who murdered George Floyd, and also to do more reform work in the criminal legal system, right? So that's what they were protesting about. But what was seen on the other side was, this is the future, right, of America, and this is an America of a multiracial democracy in which people are cooperating around certain types of ideas. Where does that leave certain parties in terms of their political future? But everything that has happened is a demonstration of some of the core theories of critical race theory as it's conceived in the legal academy. I'm sure we will see, I'm not a critical race theorist myself, but I'm sure we will see people who are practitioners in critical race theory begin to tell the story of this legislative movement from that particular lens. Chris, you had your hand up. Okay.
Thanks, Danielle. This is such a phenomenal talk that's making me feel so mortified. I wonder whether you can comment on the broader global and cultural context in which this is all happening. I mean, on the global side, I kind of alluded to this earlier, I can think of so many examples, but one close to me, Hong Kong. And prior to the current Beijing stuff, national security law, but 7 or 8 years ago, there was a movement that I feel is very similar to this, to memory laws and prohibiting certain kinds of curricula that made students feel bad about themselves and made them unpatriotic, et cetera. And I wonder why that illiberal moment or extended moment there, here, across so many different cultures. And then just kind of related to that, it feels to me as if there's some kind of escalatory arms race going on, that I could think of for example, the decolonization of the curriculum movement, to which I'm sympathetic, and the idea that, look, power affects the production of knowledge, and we need to be sensitive to that. But aspects of that movement have certain pieces of illiberalism, the desire to, the framing of certain kinds of literatures harm students, shouldn't be taught, maybe some efforts to get not legal moves, but institutions to maybe write some strictures. And then it seems the right, and that form of illiberalism, kind of ups the ante, or somehow in this arms race, and now we end up with this. So am I reading that right? What's the broader context in which this is happening?
I would say the global context, and I'll talk about one thing that I heard just a few weeks ago that really put me in the mindset of critical race theory, but I think I didn't talk a lot about memory laws, but the idea of government passing laws that tell you how to interpret historical events, right? So that did not start with this movement, didn't start in the United States. And we see it for positive. So we see it in Europe around saying, okay, it's criminal to teach that the Holocaust did not happen, right? Or to say we can't remember certain things, or wanting to characterize, we must acknowledge the Armenian genocide, for example, is a piece of legislation. So memory laws definitely are part of this, the idea that there's only one way to tell the history of a country, and in this case, the notion that there is an American story and then there's anti-American stories, and according to this legislation, acknowledgement of things like slavery, Jim Crow, et cetera, are anti-American propaganda. So I think absolutely we see this as a global movement. What's interesting is when I listened to Putin's speech right before they went into Ukraine, the reframing of the history that he was doing in that speech really reminded me of these laws. And so the idea that history and who owns it and how we tell those stories very much can give rise to anything from wanting to put aside, work around criminal justice reform, all the way to justifying a war against another country. Tell me the second part of your question again.
Just about.
Oh yeah, so
arms
in liberalism,
race.
we've been debating, since I was in college, the question of what is the canon, right? So what is the canon in English? What is the canon in history or in political science or anywhere else? And a lot of this in the 90s and in the early 2000s was coming from the left, who would say, okay, people like Toni Morrison should be included, and they're not included. And so I think the idea that this can happen both from the left and from the right, I think is absolutely true. It's a war over what is the truth, what should be taught, how people should be educated, a war around knowledge, essentially. Yes.
Thank you. Wonderful talk. And I just have a question. I just want your opinion. To what end? Where do you think this is all going, right? You talked about it being kind of not partisan, right? But there's a great deal of emotion in decisions around critical race theory and what should be taught, what shouldn't be taught. And I'm just wondering, asking you to speculate, what do you think this is going in terms of not only for K-12 education, but just in terms of education itself? Because it does have implications for both public and private higher ed.
I've thought about that question a lot. I'm not sure if it has any purpose or end intention other than the most obvious political wedge issue. So driving a governor's race one way or the other, using it in a presidential, I really think it's as base as that. I don't think there's anything underneath it that's more substantive in terms of actually banning these concepts. I do think that there was a lot, and I'll leave this to other scholars to determine because I don't think we know quite yet, to develop data on the question of, did children, young people, so the summer of 2020 was very much like Freedom Summer in the 1960s, in the sense that this was a movement powered by young people. I'm imagining these young people coming home to their parents and saying, you should read White Fragility. You should read How to Be an Anti-Racist. And how much of the fear that this was from the fact that young people were really driving that particular movement. And so I have a feeling that there is something there that we will be able to put our fingers on and have more qualitative and quantitative data around why did this take hold in the way it did, especially among voters who are parents. And some of the voters who are most into this are not parents. But I do think that we'll find that there's some connection between the idea that rights movements are typically the movements of young people. The Black Lives Matter movement is no different. And I think there's a certain amount of fear that parents have when young people, and remember, the people who were protesting in the summer of 2020, you saw faces that looked like they were 10, 11, 12 years old. So you can imagine having a preteen coming home and telling their parents, you don't understand white privilege, right? So those kinds of things I think we will find over time really did cause polling and other things that people do to figure out what are the messages that resonate. I think that's why that messaging was so sticky, because people were experiencing it in their own homes. Yes.
Thank you so much for your talk. It was wonderful. I'm really involved in my local school district in Southern California, and right now, it's a really interesting political location. It's very predominantly white, wealthy beach suburb. And so there's a lot of Democratic supporters, a lot of liberalism, also a lot of conservatism, and there was, I don't know if you heard about this, but my town was where the Bruce Beach controversy happened. So also a lot of rhetoric about this is not a racist town, we shouldn't be teaching that we are racist people. Mm-hmm. And so that's, there's also been a lot of controversy about critical race theory in our public school district. And I'm not worried about my school board representatives. On the whole, they're not really buying into any of this rhetoric, but the parents are very much affected by it. And so there's a struggle to sort of combat all of the rhetoric that they're spewing, and I think that what you're saying about rebranding is really insightful. But I worry sometimes about, in rejecting the idea that this is critical race theory that's being taught in schools, which is ridiculous, I wonder if that demonizes it as something that shouldn't be taught in schools, because I think that the idea that racism is something that is not just individual but is systemic should also be taught to younger children. So I'm wondering if you have any insights about that.
That's a great point. I mean, I think part of the chilling effect of this that I was talking about is the chilling of teaching of anti-racist concepts in public schools, right? Which could also be part of the point. Is there expansion of diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts in public school districts? Is there expansion of anti-racist teaching? This definitely puts anyone who's a proponent of those things on the defensive, right? Because you spend a lot of time fighting the bills that are currently proposed or trying to get favorable interpretations of law that's already on the books, and it keeps you from advocating for the expansion of anti-racist teaching, which I think is sorely needed in many of our schools and school districts. So absolutely, it has the impact of not only stopping teaching that was happening, but stopping parents from calling for more of that. Not just parents, but teachers, professors, others in the State Board of Education and local school boards who thought that this was a valuable part of the curriculum.
Hi, thanks so much. I also have a question about California, more related to ethnic studies, because it did pass legislation requiring ethnic studies, which does have as key tenets a lot of the anti-racist pedagogy and that these other states are banning. So I'm just curious how you think about California within this broader national context, and what it might, like what makes it different, what would it take for similarly progressive states to follow that trajectory?
I don't think the answer is probably for states that have not gone down this path. And again, there's 43 states that have, so most states have some form of this type of legislation pending. For them to, on the other side, say, okay, we want to, in the law, install the idea that we are teaching certain concepts. I think we should leave that for the State Board of Education, for local school districts, and ultimately for teachers and professors in public colleges and universities to make those decisions for themselves. What I will say about California is that this is, when we think of federal government, state government, local government, this is very much what's happening in parts of California will not happen in other parts of California. So even if we don't see a lot of statewide legislation, I think what you'll see is at the local level variations on this, especially as it goes to removing books from public school libraries and also moving away from certain types of curriculum or towards other types of curriculum, which again is worrying because the idea of public school children being exposed to very broad curriculum in some parts of the state and having narrow curriculum in other parts of the state.
Great, well then, please join me in thanking Dean Danielle Holley-Walker.